we're going to moderate by chat, a chat function. So if you see in the bottom right hand side of your screen a little pink arrow, you can click that and you will see a chat bubble on the right hand side of that column, and you will be able to see chat. Just say hello. We're really happy with the level of engagement. We already have 33 attendees. It would be lovely to hear where people are watching from and where people are engaging from. That would be really lovely to hear. I'm in Barry in South Wales myself. So we have London, Penard, Cardiff, Manchester, Folkestone and Kent, Nottingham, Martha, Canterbury, Teesside. These are all coming in fast. Lovely to see. Port Talbot, great stuff. Abergavenny, Chester, Leeds, Edinburgh, Penard, Derby, more Edinburgh. Fantastic. Canada, Swansea, wonderful. Truly international event. Great stuff. Okay. So just so to remind people of the lineup, we have this welcome, and then we have the first session, which will be a 20-minute presentation entitled InstaStan, FaceBrook, Brecht Plus, a performer training methodology for the age of the internet, co-authored by Dr. Christina Papagiannouli and Dr. Sarah Cruz, both of the University of South Wales. And then we will have session 2, and that is comprises of a presentation called Preparing Ourselves, Performer Training and Technology, from our guest speaker, Dr. Maria Kapsali of the University of Leeds. And then we'll have the Q&A, panel Q&A after both sessions. So we'll just wait a little longer. That starts in the next few minutes. There's some difficulties. A couple of people are having problems with sound. I think it is just a couple, so it might be on your side. Cool. Sounds excellent from Myrta. Cool. Okay. Okay. So we have people seeing two faces.
Hi, Maria. Can you see me?
Yeah, I think it might be activated by the microphone. So, yeah. Great stuff. Okay. Shall we get started? Christina, would you like, shall we go ahead into it?
Yes, I think we start.
Oh, cool. So I'll just before as I say, this is a co-authored presentation by Dr. Sarah Cruz and Christina Papagiannouli. Unfortunately, Sarah can't make it with us, but she's a senior lecturer in performance and media at the University of South Wales, where she leads the BA Performance and Media degree and teaches new media performance, performer training for stage and screen, and critical and cultural theory. She is also a co-convener of TAPRA's Bodies and Performance Working Group. And presenting today, we have Dr. Christina Papagiannouli, who is a research fellow in performance and interactive and immersive technology at the University of South Wales, where she also lectures performance and new media. She is also co-convener of TAPRA's Performance and New Technologies Working Group. Over to you, Christina.
Thanks, Denis. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Hello. Just to say, I'm still in Cardiff, and of course, I'm still in a lockdown. Things are changing for some other countries, but not yet for us. And especially for me, that my family and some of my friends are in Greece. It's a bit strange because they've gone already out of lockdown, but I'm still inside. But it's great that we've managed to do this session online, this event online. We were planning to do it in the atrium in Cardiff, but unfortunately, due to the circumstances, we thought, let's experiment. Let's try and do an online event on Blackbird Collaborate. So let me share my presentation. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the work I've been doing with Sarah, and unfortunately, Sarah is not today. She couldn't make it today, as she is on sick leave at the moment. And we work together, teach the module of new media performance, which is for second year BA performance and media students. And we've been teaching that for some years now. And we have developed some methodologies in terms of how we work with the students, but also how we can use different technologies to engage students in theatre and performance. And as part of this collaboration, we co-authored the article that Denis mentioned that was published in the Theatre, Dance and Performance Training Journal. And so my presentation is going to talk about some of those ideas that, although they were actually created before COVID-19, they might give some ideas of how we can work now in the COVID-19 era where we need to do everything online. And where we work online, we have maybe we'll have to continue teaching online for some time, but also we perform online as the lockdown and the social distancing measures don't allow us to come together in a space and work together in a space. So in this module, we have actually focused a lot on different digital performance and online theatre technologies. And we've looked at different artists and companies, how they have used the internet for online theatre adaptations or for telematic performance purposes or for network performance. So this might be a bit useful for now, although they were actually created for working with the performers in a physical space using digital technologies. It could be translated for completely remote online training. So I'm going to discuss Brecht class, which is really related on documentation and feedback, or cyber documentation and cyber feedback. I'm going to talk about FaceBrook, which is mainly the cyber collaboration aspect, collaborating remotely via the internet, and the empty cyberspace or the cyber stage, the use of the internet as a stage, and finally, InstaStan, which is about building and exploring characters online in different ways. So we actually have been using Brecht a lot, and also in our approach to teaching as a laboratory for experimentation and learning. In general, our approach to performer training is holistic in the sense that it encourages exploration and engagement with all aspects of performance making, from designing, planning, and devising to rehearsing and performing for a live audience. We combine traditional rehearsal and performance practices with apps and social media, which for the most part constitute the first language of a new generation of performers, the I generation, and belong to their daily practice and spaces. The internet offers a range of digital tools and platforms for documentation and archival purposes, including blogs and social media. Documentation was an important element of Brecht's training methodology. Brecht used recording methods such as notate, notes, to train young directors, and model books, a series of photographs with captions detailing specific gestures and positions for each production. Notate were written by Brecht's assistants as a training exercise and combined description, analysis, and reflection. So it's really like what we do as an assessment purposes. Most of trainers like writing a journal or a blog to describe, analyze, and reflect on the student performer's rehearsal process and the performance outcome. As David Barnett highlights, Brecht notes are not just records of rehearsals, but writings that seek to get inside the process to account for why a decision has been made or why it has been discarded. Brecht used these blog-like and album-like documentation methods mainly for pedagogical purposes, as a dialogue between theoretical commentary, playwriting, and staging, rather than as a means of recording performance. Thus, this kind of media, like for example Instagram, and I like using the Instagram example because it really looks like the model books of Brecht with how the images are set, can serve as a dialogic performance training platforms, and where audiences actually can also respond to it and interact with it. Our approach to critical thinking and practice extends to self-evaluation, observation, and feedback practices. Student performers are invited to observe and give feedback to each other, while they are also constantly encouraged to self-evaluate their work. Brecht also sought feedback from less experienced and less qualified sources, such as young audience members, theatre technicians, and even his driver. By using social media to connect and interact with audiences, student performers receive feedback from different sources during the rehearsal process, as well as during the actual performance, when it's online and uses the online tools, due to the real character of those digital interactions. Facebook and Instagram live streaming, for example, provide tools for visual, like emoticons, textual, chat, and audiovisual. For example, Instagram allows two people live streaming interaction where performers can invite audiences on Instagram to ask them questions, for example. Moreover, engaging with and studying those online public-like platforms helps student performers understand Brecht's VFX strategies, such as fixing the null path, which is Brecht's strategy to identify contradictions between the actor and the character, and gestures. So social media platforms are actually flooded by contradictions, debates, and different perspectives. They also provide stylized forms of written language that embody social structures in a similar way as Brecht's stylized acting of gestures aimed to demonstrate social class in relation to body language. So written language can actually reflect social structures in different ways, from the choice of words to repetition of commonly used phrases to spelling mistakes and modes of writing, formal or informal, to the use of language. And it's interesting when we go, for example, on a YouTube video and we look at the different comments under the videos, we can see all those contradictions and debates happening, but also we can identify specific ways that people interact and create written gestures for, let's say, an online character and how that character responds to the performance in a different way. In terms of Brook, as I said, we mainly looked at the empty space or the empty cyberspace. Brook's thoughts on the empty space, that someone enters this empty space while someone else is present. And this is all that is needed for an act of theater to be engaged. We noticed that, of course, Brook was talking about a physical meeting place, but we found that the same imaginative connection can be initiated within a virtual cyberspace. For example, Google Docs. And when we were working with Sarah on this article, we used Google Docs, and it was very interesting as a completely empty stage where we flooded this with words and images, and we were writing together. And it was very interesting that when there are two people on Google Docs, you can see each other's writing process. You can see someone style of writing, the flow of writing, deleting, rewriting, editing. This really becomes like a performative act on its own. Also, our students have used Google Docs for some of their experiments, and they have invited audiences to co-write with them, co-script with them the performance or the happening using those empty spaces. And this allows for some sort of a cyber collaboration to take place between the performers, first of all, where they can co-create together, like we co-created the article, but also to allow audiences to enter and play and become collaborators themselves. And students have used also Facebook groups, Skype and other online platforms to develop their work and also to rehearse as rehearsal spaces. And when we were back into buildings, we always had this issue of how we can meet and where we can meet, because it's difficult to find a physical space, or for artists it's expensive to find a physical space. But especially for the initial experiments, online spaces can be used for this kind of collaboration. And I think now more and more we understand how this work, and we actually have to use them because of the lockdown and the social distancing. And maybe it can be a space where we can use it later on as well, because it allows the art platforms that allow co-creation. Either this is a text or a drawing. It's very interesting how you can actually work as a group and create something from scratch. Now, in terms of Stanislavski, we've mainly used Stanislavski for building characters profiles, but also exploring characters on social media and posting messages as if the character student performers engaged with Stanislavski Magic If and his system of using the imagination to build and explore a character. Rebecca Watzko and John Curran recognized the potentials of character building on social media to add the development of characters for a traditional theater setting. As they argue, building a character's detailed profile on social media increases its depth and fosters authenticity. Answering a Facebook characters profile question, and here are the different questions. It's like answering Stanislavski's question, who am I? And also posting, looking at the question, what's on your mind, that asks you Facebook when you want to post a message. You can actually explore in depth your character and use your imagination for the given circumstances to either build new characters from scratch or to explore existed characters from a play. On the other hand, Stanislavski's questions, why do I want it? How will I get it? And what do I need to do to overcome something? Can be useful for student performers to make them think about and articulate questions such as, why do I share it on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter? How will I attract the interest of social media followers? And what do I need to do to get more comments, likes, and shares? This could be used both to assist them to build a narrative around their character's posts, as well as to articulate a methodology for engaging with their online audiences. We have been using this as well as an exercise for students to explore their characters and build their characters from scratch. And then actually we used a hot seating exercise where other students would ask them questions. And this, of course, happened in a physical space, but this can be transferred into a digital one. That could be Facebook chat, for example, where you can ask questions, or it can be Instagram that allows a character to have a one-to-one conversation with one of the followers, and that can change on the time. So new people can come in, new questions can be asked towards the character, and new insights can be found in relation to who the character is, but also the given circumstances, and the potential subtext of the character in more detail. So it's not just about exploring and building new characters, but it's also about creating digital footprints of a character. So it doesn't have to be just as an exploration, but it can be the actual character being on Twitter or the actual character being on Facebook and performing from there. And we've seen this with Royal Shakespeare Company's such Tweet Shadow, where character used Twitter to perform the Romeo and Juliet for the internet age. But of course, it doesn't have to be used only for creating online characters, because it's also a way of exploring offline characters and then taking the rehearsal and then coming back into the physical space and using what you have learned through this experience into performing a play or creating a new performance. But most importantly for me is that these tunes allow you to interact with audiences. They allow you to play with audiences before the performance or during the actual performance. So to conclude, really, I'm not going to focus so much on Brook, on FaceBrook, as we discussed, is this idea of something like an empty stage, that anything can be an empty stage, really, like even Instagram, and you feel it and you float it and you co-create together with the other performers, or you even invite audiences to co-create with you. In terms of Brecht, I think some of the useful social media and online platforms in terms of the visual model books is Instagram, because it really looks like how Brecht's model books looked like, with an image and you can have a caption. For the digital notes and the journals, online journals, I think blogs are really useful because they don't just allow you to write and reflect on your work, but the way that blogs are constructed, you can add other media in it. You can add images and videos and link with other websites. So it allows you to create a transmedia story of the rehearsal process. In terms of online feedback, of course, anything where you can present and then audiences can give you feedback in real time could be really helpful. We've used a lot Facebook streaming where audiences can chat and you can see those chats coming in while you stream, and that can be very useful in terms of working towards a performance. But also YouTube. And YouTube is really interesting to look around and see how people respond in terms of the written gestures, because you can see the comments below and they're flooded with comments. And you can learn a lot from how different people respond to the same themes. And now in terms of the Stanislavski, Facebook, it's really good in terms of asking the right questions to look more in depth into a character and trying to identify the as if the magic, if what would my character want to listen, or what film would be my character's favorite film. But also Twitter, and I'm using here action analysis because I have found quite useful when working with the text. And looking the different bits of the text to write short tweets like of 140 characters that summarize what the action is in this. And I really like this restriction of the 140 characters because it makes you really think in terms of you need to be detailed, but it also allows you to be playful and have hashtags instead that give a sense of what the main, the most important bit of this section is, of this unit, and in terms of action analysis. And finally, Instagram, I think it's a great platform for hot sitting, exactly for what it allows you to live stream, and then anytime you want, you can invite a follower to pop in, ask a question, and then you can remove that and add another one and get this kind of Q&A process going on. So that's all for me, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Christina. That was really fascinating. It was lovely to hear about different pedagogies and things coming through. And can I just encourage everybody to think about the questions for the Q&A. We're getting a couple of applause there in the chat, so thank you for that. As we're about to move on to our guest speaker, as say, people can think about the questions they want to ask. If you could indicate if you have a specific question for Christina, just make clear that it's for Christina or Maria. That would be very helpful for me later on to get questions to the guys. Okay, so as I say, we're about to have our second session, which is a presentation by Dr. Maria Kapsali of University of Leeds. Maria is a lecturer in physical performance in the School of Performance and Cultural Industries at the University of Leeds. She is the co-editor with Dr. Rebecca Lokes of the Perspectives on Performer training series with Routledge. And with Professor Frank Camilleri of the special issue of Performance Research Journal on Hybridity, which is out October 2020. Her presentation will draw on her forthcoming monograph, Preparing Ourselves, Performer Training and Technology, Routledge 2020. So over to you, Maria. Yeah.
Hello, everybody, and thank you, Christina, for organizing this. And thank you, Denis, for sharing, and thank you everyone for tuning in. So as Denis said, the material I'm going to share with you today comes from a book I've just finished writing, and it should be coming out in October. Obviously, again, as Christina was saying before about her own work, I started writing the book before the COVID-19 pandemic. But while I was finishing writing it, I basically finished writing it and I submitted it during the lockdown. And clearly the lockdown made us think a lot, both about our digital practices and technologies, but also our physical practices and technologies, especially during a period when being co-present in a studio together in intimate exchanges and surroundings can, of course, be lethal. So the book initially was conceived in response to several things. I'm just going to quickly touch upon them. So first of all was the technologization of performing arts industry. So we see the increasing use of several different technologies in performance. We see the development of new genres of performance, such as intermediate performance, that uses extensively digital technologies, but we also see different employment opportunities for performers that are specifically related to performance, such as motion capture, that have kind of give rise to a whole training that is dedicated to this kind of technology. At the same time, we also see an increase in modes of blended learning within institutions. So for performer training that is taking place within academic institutions, technology is coming in relation to all the other interfaces that the students are expected to be able to use, students and trainers, of course. And as Christina mentioned before, we also see the penetration of digital devices in daily life and performance. So Christina mentioned before Generation I. I'm sure laptops and screens and mobile phones are now part of the environment that surrounds us, at least in the global north. So to me, I suppose one possibility would be to explore how different technologies, especially digital technologies, how they can be used as tools for generating performer training knowledge, or for disseminating performer training material, or for even developing new forms of performer training. But as I started engaging with the subject matter further, I started becoming aware of certain affinities between performer training and technology, more in terms of embodied and philosophical dimension of both of those practices. And I particularly engaged with the field of philosophy of technology that is looking not only at digital technology, but technology in general. And from there, I started bringing, if you want, certain tools and certain theories as lenses that can allow us to understand performer training, but also see how performer training may be a site or a space or a praxis for enabling us to respond and negotiate our relationships with technology, especially during a time when technology is one of the ways we have at our disposal in order to communicate with one another. So this is, if you want, the kind of the backstory and the wider background to the study. And today I just wanted to touch base on two of those points where I found that performer training and philosophy performer training and technology meet. So before I will continue talking, I just want us to look at one picture which I think is quite representative of what is going on. So I'm just gonna share one image here. Okay, so I'm hoping that this is becoming to appear on your screens. I'll start talking about it, and if it appears in a little while, I'm sure you can catch up. So as we look at the picture, I assume that quite a lot of you might be familiar with what is showing, and you would identify it as a picture that exemplifies or captures a moment of performer training. So what we see here is quite common things. We see a group of 9 people. They're dressed in what we often call loose clothing. They all appear to be doing the same movement. They all face the same way. And they are collectively engaged in a moment of transmission of embodied knowledge. They're practicing something, they're learning to do something that we can assume will later enable them to perform. If we look a little bit closer, we will also see that the picture is a little bit more complicated. So above the performers are in fact cameras that reflect light, and this light is then reflected from the bodysuits that those 4 performers in black are wearing. So we begin to understand that what is also going on here is that some people, some of the trainees are dressed in the suit used for motion capture, and they are in fact in underneath a motion capture camera array, which picks up the reflective markers, the data from the reflective markers. And if we see at the kind of the deep end of the picture, we also see that what the trainees are facing is a kind of a nondescript graphic visualization of the human body. And in fact, they are engaging in an act of lifting one leg, about to take a step, and we can also assume that this is what the graphic visualization is in fact performing. So effectively what we've got here is a mode and a moment of knowledge transmission that is coming from the graphic visualization and is then embodied by the students, by the trainees. The picture comes from the MFA in acting that is taking place at the Ohio University, and is in fact a moment from a recording of Marceau, the mime artist, motion captured in 2001. And now that material is being used by Janine Thompson, who runs the MA with students today. And although she's trained with Marceau and she's a mime artist herself, she still uses the motion capture material as a teaching tool for the students. So I really like this picture, and I wanted to start with this picture because on one hand is quite nondescript, is quite it seems very kind of standard of what we would expect that is happening during a training session. But then on the other hand, quite a lot of interesting things are happening. So we see, for example, the encounter between an embodied historic regime with a digital technology, which is still only available at institutional level. And what I began to become really, really interested in is that space, if you want, that notional and real space between avatar and the trainees, that space that begins to open up between the actual real bodies and then the particular affordances that the digital artifacts can make available to us, but also the particular repertoires or the particular ideologies or the particular ways of thinking that often come with technology, and not just digital technology. So before I tell you anything more, what I would like us to do now is just do a short activity, and I'm just gonna say it out loud, but I'm also gonna copy and paste the activity on the chat. And if you want, you can also write on the chat your responses. So there are 3 steps to the activity. I'm just gonna post now. So what I would like you to do first is list the technologies that either the technologies that you see in the picture or in the space you are in currently, or the technologies that you are using as part of your own practice. So if you just take 2-3 minutes and just write down the list that makes up those technologies. And feel free, if you would like to post this on the chat, you're free to do so. Great, thank you. More responses might be coming in. Now, the second thing I would like you to consider is just think the training or the learning that you have to undergo in order to be able to use those technologies you've just listed. And this might be training you undertook yourself, or maybe training, bespoke training that you have to access through a particular curriculum or through a particular source. But how if you want, the question I'm asking is, how did you end up knowing and being able to use these specific technologies? Okay, and then just feeding off from Nazli's great. So yes, so David is making a very good point. I'm going to touch upon in a minute, saying that it would take 2-3 years per technology to be able to master it. And of course, what is happening with digital technologies is that they become updated. quite often. So there is the sense that if you want to use it, you need to be able to catch up. Yeah, Karen is talking about trial and error, asking experts for advice. Again, trial and error comes in the second response we got from John. And also, Nazli's response has been really interesting, Christina as well, and they're talking about experimentation. The last thing that I would like you to consider is if you, either by accident or by choice, whether you ended up using one of those technologies in a way other than the prescribed or established one. So just to give you a very, very daft example, you know, if I want to lie on the floor and I want to raise my head off the floor, I might use my laptop to do so. Clearly, the laptop has not been designed to support my head when I lie on the floor, but it might be a way that I use it if I have nothing else available. So are there any ways in which you started using those technologies you listed that fall beyond or outside the way they've been prescribed to be used? Great. Great. Okay. So, Christina, maybe at the Q&A you can tell us a little bit more about how good the laptop is for keeping the coffee warm. How long does it keep the coffee warm for? Great, fantastic. Okay, so maybe we're just gonna come back to those examples, but I'm just gonna I'm just gonna move on, just outlining that kind of philosophical shared ground between performer training and technology I shared about before. So if you're familiar with scholarship and practice on performer training, it would be fair to say that in the last 15 years or so, performer training has demonstrated a critical awareness and interrogation of the constituent part that make up training. For example, the terminologies and the discourses, the exercises, and the methods of transmission that make up specific pedagogies. Exemplary of such stance is Simon Murray's call to, I'm quoting, identify and foreground a politics of actor training, where positions of claims and neutrality, disinterest or ignorance are untenable. Murray's proposal points to the possibility of performer training to create a place where, I quote again from Murray, we can play, imagine, become unruly, collaborate and experiment with prefigurative behaviors and relations which resist the encroachments of economic and cultural commodification. Echoing Murray, Ben Spatz similarly asks if, I'm quoting, the politics of actor training may extend beyond the preparation of young actors for the stage, but intersect directly with other kinds of embodied pedagogies by revealing and foreclosing possible avenues of everyday practice. Training then becomes reconstituted as a praxis of resistance and a site where different relationships with the everyday can be rehearsed. It is in this configuration that the common ground with technology begins to emerge. Expressing a concern for the intensifying presence of technology in contemporary societies, scholars, and here we can list quite a few people. Stigler is one of them, Jonathan Crary, Wedland, argue that technology needs to be examined not only in terms of the functionalities and effects of isolated artifacts, but also as a consolidation of a way of being in the world that increasingly makes environmental processes, human actions, biological cycles, and psychic landscapes legible only in terms of use and optimization. Jonathan Crary, for example, contends that whereas, I'm quoting, markets and global infrastructure for continuous work and consumption have been in place for some time, now a human subject is in the making to coincide with this more intensively. What Crary and other scholars emphasize is that technology, especially in the context of global capitalism, is no longer limited to making things, consumer products, machine, equipment, and so on, but it is insidiously underpinning the way humans are constituted as subjects and operate in the world. What is more, the penetration of digital technologies in several aspects of daily life entails that we now live in a technological environment that we can neither fully conceive nor control, since technology operates in ways that transcend human modes of perception. Aileen O'Donnell, for example, notes that, I'm quoting, the surplus of information produced by algorithm-based exchange flows of data and information exceeds any human capacity for assimilation and comprehension. It verges on an experience of the sublime, paralyzed, but without a moment of redemption or any sense of the power of one's faculties. End of quote. In response, scholars highlight the need to develop alternative relations to technology. Some assign this task to education and emphasize the importance of developing forms of practice, including artistic practice, that transcend the kind of use stipulated by external agendas, which often serve hegemonic yet invisible corporate interests. So the kind of practices you mentioned before, exemplified by Christina's use of the laptop as a coffee warmer, would fall under this category, how we develop practices that actually move beyond how we're expected to use technology. A key idea that emerges repeatedly and cuts across accounts of technology, as well as artistic practice that involves technology, is the need for the development of a new sensibility. According to Mark Rothel, sensibility is, I quote, a condition in which we come to grasp the sense that governs our activities. We are aware, in other words, why it makes sense to do something or refrain from doing something. Some scholars argue that the development of such disposition can better emerge from practices that do not involve technology. Dreyfus, for example, talks about stargazing and taking long walks to the park, which is something we might all find ourselves doing these days, whilst others suggest that such sensibility can only be possible through interactions with technologies. This debate can be traced also in the field of performance and performer training, with some practitioners, for example, Michael Alfreds and Catherine Hunter, arguing that performance should consciously resist the spread of technology, whilst others, for example, Susan Kozel is a good example, suggesting that it can offer a productive space to explore our relationship with it. So I think it's important when we're talking about performer training and technology, or indeed performance and technology, to always remind ourselves that there is quite a strong current in the field, which we could call it anti-technological, or in some cases even technophobic. And I think, although in some cases some of these arguments may come across as quite naive or even completely contradictory, I think it's also important to bear in mind that there is, if you want, a very conscious and perhaps a very necessary attempt to resist what is sometimes a compulsory technologization of artistic practice and life. A key point of agreement that kind of unites both the technophilic and the technophobic thesis is that sensibility has an intrinsic embodied dimension. And as Rothel observes, alternative relations to technology cannot be limited to the teaching of decontextualized theories, They are premised on the development of bodily skills. Rothel, in fact, speaks of a kind of training that, I quote, could be accomplished through an apprenticeship in skillful behavior. Here is then the crucial point where performer training and technology meet. From one end, thinkers of contemporary culture call for a new disposition, a new sensibility that can bring forward new modes of operation and ways of being in the world. From the other end, scholars of performer training appreciate that training can catalyze a critical redefinition of selfhood and repositioning of the subject in the world. It is precisely the seam between these two positions that performer training scholarship and practice can begin to mine. Can performer training, in its double function as an education in embodiment, as well as a form of education that has a significant embodied dimension, become a privileged site for exploring how relationships to technology are constituted? Even more ambitiously, can it offer the space, tools, opportunities for rehearsing alternative ways of approaching technology that could engender the new sensibility that is envisioned by scholars of both technology and performance? Under what conditions can such promise be fulfilled? So if you want, what I'm trying to sketch out here, or if you want, what I'm arguing is that in addition to exploring and experimenting the use of specific technologies in our practice or in our writing, there is also the performer training as a praxis in and of itself can be a very productive space for enabling us to rethink our relationship with technology in very pragmatic ways. The idea that an alternative relationship to technology, and the many forms this might take, is both needed and in need of preparation is not new. It is encountered, for example, in Martin Heidegger's seminal essay, The Question Concerning Technology, which intended to put forward a way of thinking about technology that, I quote, will prepare a free relationship to it. And what Heidegger means by a free relationship is an opportunity to be able to use technology, but without being subjected to what he was referring to as technological thinking. And technological thinking is, in my view, very much what has been naturalized today, where everything seems as a resource that can be exploited and optimized. Indeed, Rothel observes that Heidegger's later work has been devoted, I'm quoting, to developing a curriculum for training us to see through the never-ending whirl of technological optionalization. Yet, such curriculum is exclusively in written form, which presumably leads Rothel to call for the inclusion of bodily skills. A crucial point still to receive attention by philosophers of technology concerns the process of preparation, especially if we agree that such process is by necessity an embodied one. A well-known example in philosophical literature on technology illustrates the issue. In one of his later essays, Heidegger bemoans the use of the typewriter, arguing that its materiality disrupts the fluidity of handwriting and homogenizes the uniqueness not only of written characters, but thinking. About 50 years following Heidegger's essay, Don Eid published a book called Heidegger's Technologies, where he is very, very critical of Heidegger's approach to technology. And in that book, Don Eid points out that Heidegger's argument derives from his inability to use the typewriter in a competent manner. So Heidegger cannot typewrite, and unsurprisingly, he finds that the equipment gets in the way of the task that he's expected to accomplish. Eid further notes that before any technology can be used skillfully and smoothly, I quote, there has to be a learning and accommodation resistance process, which is the kind of process I invited you to very quickly consider in relation to the technologies you've got around you. So technology is not something that we can use straight away. It requires some kind of engagement and some kind of learning process. Moreover, in a related study that considers cultural variations in the design and use of bow and arrow, I acknowledge that, quote, one can see that the simple machine paired with skilled embodiment practices now produces a new tool trajectory. So what IDE does in these studies, he's looking at various variations of how different cultures use bow and arrow, and basically argues that once the embodied practice of archery changes, then we also see a change in the tool as well. And equally, when there are changes in the tool, this also affects changes in the embodied practice of archery. Here again, I'd echoing with a wider thesis that different relationships to technology are premised on the development of new practices, explicitly recognizes the importance of embodied skill in effecting changes in the material artifact and taking its use in a new direction. What is, however, not considered in depth is the process through which such skill becomes acquired. Yet, as performer training amply demonstrates, learning how to use equipment, or indeed developing a new kind of practice, does not follow a fixed trajectory leading to a predetermined result. It is, as Rebecca Laux observes in relation to her work with sticks, not a given, it is something that is cultivated. And such cultivation is complex, processual, intersubjective, historically and culturally contingent, and produces different forms of experience, knowledge, and expertise. From this point of view, and as Maria attests, I quote, skill and competence acquisition are generative rather than fixed structures. So, as I assume if you entered any process of performer training or in fact music training, your experience might also be that this is not in any way a linear process at all. There are ups and downs, there are circles, and what we find through ongoing training that takes place through a number of years is that as we develop certain skills, we also change. So the person who started the training is not the same person as with the person that continues with the training 2 or 3 years down the line. Since the use of technology relies on a fluid process of learning, then training is by default central to the idea that relationships to technology need not be fixed. They can be tested, reconsidered, and constituted anew. Rothel's assertion, therefore, signals a welcome appreciation of the fact that training can be a place where relationships with technology are not simply established, but negotiated, precisely because training covers the space between inept and adept performance. Nonetheless, against the thesis that an alternative relationship to technology can be trained or affected through training, stands a more pessimistic view that holds that any such effort is at best naive, at worst complicit with hegemonic interests. Since technology now shapes nothing less than the very sensorium of human beings, regardless of whether a specific artifact is used or not, the argument goes, any attempt to occupy a position outside of this matrix is untenable. David Berry, for example, notes that, I quote, as our reliance on these technical systems grows, the technical groups responsible for these systems grow in importance, such that their rationalities expressed through particular logics embedded in the interface and the code become internalized within the user as a particular habitus or way of doing appropriate to certain activities. Echoing Berry, Crary examines a range of cultural habits that have been naturalized in Western societies, including, for example, the proliferation of screens in domestic and public spaces. He diagnoses a, quote, a systemic colonization of individual experience by network technologies, which makes other ways of life either marginalized or, worse still, unimaginable. Such assessment of the present moment may be dismissed as pessimistic or reactive. It could be argued, for example, that attributing such influence to technology fails to properly acknowledge the very aspects of human activity that escape it. Nonetheless, even if this counter-argument is upheld, an important question still remains. Considering that performer training is a cultural activity that takes place in the midst of the relentless 24/7 world Crary underbraids, how could it offer the space for alternative possibilities? In other words, what is so special about performer training that sets it apart? Indeed, on what grounds suppose that performer training can be set apart? The question brings us to the second point where technology and performer training meet. As I have argued already, according to several scholars and practitioners, performer training does not simply involve skill acquisition that will be achieved by an already formed subject. Rather, it constitutes subjects by effecting profound changes in the trainee's embodiment and selfhood. Reviewing a range of different approaches to performer training, Ian Watson observes that although training appears to prioritize the performer's professionalization, with a range of methods focusing on the mastery of a certain craft, the craft, Watson says, portends to a wider world, a broader spectrum of experience, learning, and education. Arguably, the most banal yet foundational aspect of performer training is that training turns the trainee into an instrument. This operation can have both empowering and disempowering results. On the one hand, training expands the means of expression available to the trainee, in the process opening up potential subject positions and enhancing one's sense of creative and artistic agency. On the other hand, training also institutes docility and compliance, preparing the trainee to fit within and accept established. I'm sorry, I lost my line there. On the other hand, training also institutes docility and compliance, preparing the trainee to fit within and accept established economic and professional structures. It bears noting that these two perspectives are not mutually exclusive, but invoke a dialectic between discipline and unruliness, embodiment and inscription that is played out on the trainee's body and possibly throughout one's career. Training, like technology, is masterful. It can both discipline the subject in a series of normative positions, for example, in terms of body ideals and identity politics, but also enable the transgression of existing norms through facilitating mastery in terms of creativity, expression, and collaboration. Although this tension has been acknowledged and discussed within studies of performer training, my point is that the performer as instrument trope is inextricably connected with understandings of technology. These connections manifest in various ways, but today I would like to pay attention to one specific idea, and this is the idea of tool that is used extensively both in performer training and technology. I'm just going to quickly pause here for a moment just to ask Denis, how long do I still have, Denis? Are we still going until 3:30? Or...
you have... We'll probably go more or less straight into the Q&A. So you could take a bit more time if you need to. So about 10 minutes. Without...
No, I think if So am I okay to go until what time? The Q&A is supposed to start at 3:30, isn't it? Or...
Yeah, so if you wanted to go on till 3:30, that's absolutely fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have a little bit more that it might take us another 10-15 minutes.
Yeah, I think there was a 15-minute break built in for when it was going to be a live version. So we don't need to have that. So you can have that time.
Is that okay? I mean, we can stop here if you feel this is too much because I appreciate people have just to kind of listen quite intently. Or do you want to just follow the program as it was set up and continue until 3:30?
I think continue. I think I'm really enjoying myself. So it would be I think. Yeah,
okay.
there's people saying they want to hear more, so yeah.
Thank you. All right. So let's move to the second point then, where performer training and technology meet, and this is the idea of tool. So the term tool is used extensively in performer training and with reference to several pedagogies. It also denotes a range of different things, including objects, skills, and techniques. What is more, performer training practice not only uses a variety of artifacts, including, as we shall see, handheld tools and electric systems, but also makes tools. And as I will demonstrate, it makes tools out of the very organism of the trainee's body-mind. Similarly, the rule of thumb according to which technology is identified is the involvement of tools in human activity. For example, Andrew Finberg attests that, I quote, technology is an elaborate complex of related activities that crystallizes around tool making and using in every society. Similarly, Carl Mitcham argues that technology is, quote, stipulated to the human making and using of material artifacts in all forms and aspects. In a similar vein, Don Ide bases his post-phenomenological analysis between users, technology, and world on a distinction between what he calls mediated and non-mediated experiences of the world. Ide equates mediated experience with the use of technology and non-mediated experience with a lack thereof. Notwithstanding those technologies essential to survival, such as clothing and footwear, Ide begins his account with the non-mediated experience of walking to the beach and taking the scenery in. So Ide quite graphically kind of relays how he gets up in the morning and walks down to the beach and sits on the sand, looks at the sea and feels the breeze and so on. And what he's arguing is that this experience requires no form of mediation. He's got a direct relationship to the elements and what he's taking in from the environment. Then he progresses to describing an experience of looking through a glass window, an experience that is so slightly mediated that it's almost imperceptible that various technologies are in operation. For example, technologies around glass manufacture that moderate refraction and thus make the window quite literally transparent. Ide finally considers the use of eyeglasses, and thus the account arrives at a fully fledged example of technological use. Now, of course, you could argue that there is no such thing as a non-mediated experience. A.L. Kieran points out, I quote, the manners in which we deal with the world is mediated in many ways through symbols, language, culture, history, embodiment, and technology. So technology, we could argue, is one form of mediation, but embodiment and culture and language are other forms of mediation as well. However, let us agree for now with Ide that there is a valid distinction to be made between an experience or an activity that directly involves or requires the use of a material artifact, it needs a tool, and one that does not. Accordingly, we could identify in performer training practice a particular sensitivity towards the effects of different kinds of mediation, and in some cases, a preference for non-mediation. For example, the common practice of taking our shoes off at the beginning of a training session could be interpreted through the distinction that IDS is drawing as the removal of a technology with the aim to foster a non-mediated contact with the floor. Indeed, Ben Spatz refers to the studios that often host performer training practice as intentionally emptied spaces. He calls them zones in which technology has been cleared away in order to bring forth and make space for embodied technique. Nonetheless, and despite an emphasis on embodiment, the performer training studio is occasionally refilled with a range of material objects, including now digital technologies, and in fact, it constitutes a technology in and of itself, especially if we think at those very expensive floors that need to be installed for specific body practices. What is more, performer training demonstrates an attitude towards tools that is far more inclusive than the one that scholars of technology would be willing to admit. In 2015, the Training Ground section of the Theatre, Dance and Performance Training Journal put to performer training practitioners the question, what are your or what are the tools of training? The responses, depending on individual expertise and background, included identifiable objects, such as sticks, parts of the body, so practitioners refer to hands and toes and eyes and ears as tools, dispositions, such as full-heartedness, commitment, and conviction. They even talked about tangible tools, but they did not mean objects. They rather refer to rhythm, speed, balance, as well as consciousness, a series of recognition that the trainee undergoes. This is how Coley put it. A similar inclusivity can be noted with reference to the work of the same practitioner. For example, in the complete Stanislavski toolkit, Bella Merlin outlines a series of exercises based on Stanislavski's system that involve a wide set of resources ranging from biological processes such as breathing and relaxation, work with objects and text, as well as the subconscious, which Merlin considers to be part of the meat of the toolkit. In a similar vein, John Lutherby, who examines acting from the perspective of dynamic systems theory, points out that, I quote, what makes actors unique is the way they are able to use tools they have in common with everyone else. I identify 6 such tools: movement, language, gesture, memory, attention, and executive control. To complicate matters further, as Ellen Margolis notes, a significant part of performer training practice involves exercises with imaginary objects towards developing physical skills and/or a rich emotional life. For example, Meyerhold's etudes Throwing the Stone and Shooting an Arrow feature an imaginary stone and an imaginary arrow respectively. Equally, Mike Alfred's exercises, Creating a Mimed Activity and Developing the Handling of Mimed Objects, involve the development of a score of physical actions related to the handling and/or use of imaginary artifacts. So the evident observation here is that performer training employs an impressively diverse range of tools that are not limited to material objects. In fact, what has been recognized as a tool includes material objects, imagined objects, body parts, as well as cognitive, behavioral, and emotional traits or dispositions. What is more, the term is used to refer to skills as well as the ways, that is, the exercises and techniques with which such skills are expected to be trained. Instructive in this sense is Mark Evans' analysis of the idea of the toolbox. This is positioned in, if you know Mark's work, Movement Training for the Modern Actor. It's a fantastic monograph on movement and the body and current understandings of the actor's work. And this the section on the toolbox is positioned in a section on technique and instrumentality. And Evans regards the concept of the toolbox as a metaphor, denoting the collection of the range of technical skills a performer develops throughout their training. And he argues that the toolbox operates as a shorthand, signaling both a depository of techniques as well as a mechanism of inscription that professionalizes the trainee's body and subjectivity according to a set of values. He also acknowledges that the toolbox also evokes a sense of selection and appropriation. So his arguments draw a lot from in-depth interviews he did with students and trainers in conservatoire and drama schools in the UK. And what the students were saying is that I've got this toolbox, the trainer will give me a toolbox, but then it's my responsibility to make use of these tools and choose whichever ones are useful to me. Although Evans does not position his study in relation to debates on technology, his argument that the toolbox has both an inscriptive and an emancipatory dimension resonates with philosophical understandings of technology. The obvious difference, of course, is that what Evans has in mind are exercises, biological entities, and organic resources, whereas what philosophers of technology have in mind are material artifacts. As a result, Evans does not consider what role material tools might have in the trainee actor's toolbox, and similarly, the majority of philosophers of technology do not examine the instrumentalization of psychophysical resources, which is what is happening in performer training practice. So what the accounts of performer trainers demonstrate is that performer training practice may involve activities that, strictly speaking, do not involve the use of a material artifact. They are, in ID's terms, non-mediated and should therefore be positioned as the other of technological mediation. And in fact, those performer trainers and theatre practitioners that are against technology, they often make the argument that we shouldn't be engaging technology in the performer training session and everything should be happening through and with the actor's body. But of course, they understand the actor's body as a tool, which and as an instrument, which is, if you want, the language in which technology manifests and is understood. So there is, if you want, a kind of conceptual contradiction there. So although not using technological devices or just using the body won't involve any form of technology, this is referred to as a tool. And then if it is referred as a tool, then it would also fit the ID's category of mediated activity. So we should conclude that either in performer training, the term tool is used loosely and somewhat inaccurately, or that there is a need for an additional category of technological mediation where activities, where engagement with the world is mediated, but not through material objects. Or to put it as a form of question, does the use and making of tools in performer training practice necessitate the employment of two separate analytical frameworks, one for the use of material objects and another for the use of organic resources, such as, for example, the voice or the breath? If we accept that in performer training practice, tools are not only balls and sticks and scarves and mobile phones and laptops, but also the breath and the vocal folds, the spine, the concentration, and so many other aspects of the performer's body-mind, we need a theoretical framework that allows us to consider them together rather than separately. So one of the arguments, if you want, I'm making is that precisely because performer training involves a process of instrumentalization of the very body mind of the person, is in fact a place for us to also consider how we engage with technology, especially against big questions that have to do with how we are and how we behave in the world and how we act against the environment and what we need to do with technology now. Now, you might say that an attempt to analyze the trainee's embodied process in terms of technology runs the risk of subsuming embodiment under technology, as is, for example, the case in popular versions of transhumanism, which envisage that the use of technology will eventually enable us to transcend the materiality of the body. However, it can be argued that contemporary references to tools, such as the ones I cited, are a manifestation or a positive attitude towards instrumentalization. So if this is the case, reference to instruments and or equation of embodied technique with technology risks aligning embodied practice with the insidious technologization that is currently going on. And as I mentioned earlier, a lot of scholars and citizens are very, very uneasy about. However, the use of the term tool and indeed the prioritization of material artifacts within performer training practice often takes place within long-standing and sophisticated somatic engagements. Accordingly, when, for example, performer trainers refer to a stick as a teacher or a partner, I would argue it would be reductive to view such reference as a result of technological fetishization. I would instead propose that an analysis focuses on the links between the development of embodied practice and the materiality of the object, and whether that object is a digital or a non-digital artifact. I would further contend that performer training may serve as a suitable form of praxis for probing relationships with technology, because training, whether it uses tools or not, affects a process of instrumentalization at the most intimate level of the trainee's body mind. To put it simply, if performer training can allow us to negotiate our relationship to technology, this is not because it is alien to it, but because it is very much like it. As such, the remit of our thinking needs to extend beyond the examination of technological equipment in performer training. I'm not saying we shouldn't consider equipment or we shouldn't use it. I'm saying that there is more to think about. And consider the process of preparation that renders the trainee into an instrument of expression in relation to the promise of training to develop new ways of being in the world. An examination of performer training in relation to technology highlights the relevance that performer training knowledge and practice may have for informing our ability to respond to current crises, including this one. And if you want, kind of raises the stakes for those that are involved in performer training practice to view our praxis in relation to current concerns and not only in relation to the preparation of performers for the industry. Thank you very much. It's exactly 3:30, so I'm gonna leave it there. And I would be very happy to hear thoughts or questions if you have any. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. That was absolutely fascinating. So a couple of questions have come in, but what I propose is that maybe people take about 2 minutes just to think about questions, but also to maybe fill up their cups of tea or what have you, and that would be great. I just take this opportunity again to thank both speakers, Christina and Maria. What again, I just remind people of the chat function if you haven't used it already. It has been used throughout, and particularly through the activity. So thank you for engaging in that way. So I think if one thing that is not so much a question, but if I can just put to Maria, Mike has now left, but he asked if you could share the source where the Simon Murray you were referenced from. That was a possibility. Oh, and actually, we got another request for bibliography, but that's what maybe you think.
Yeah, the Murray one is 2015, Simon Murray 2015, and it's from an article he wrote in Theatre, Dance and Performance Training Journal called Keywords, and there he takes quite literally keywords in performer training and considers how they're used, what they mean. Yeah, and he considers quite interesting stuff such as industry, for example. A full length. I'm not sure if this is the right medium to kind of post the whole bibliography,
Yeah.
and I don't have it separately, so it would be a very, very long document. But if you're interested in a particular resource, I'm very happy to point you towards it.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Maria, when is the book coming out?
It should be October, so I can just quickly. I'm gonna post in the chat the announcement on the on Routledge's website, and there you can find more information about the book, but also about the series. And another thing I wanted to say about the series is that we're still welcoming proposals for either monographs or edited books. So if you are interested in putting a proposal together, feel free to get in touch. And now I'm just going to post the... There you go.
Thank you. Great. Okay, so because the question came in quite early for Christina from Stacey, I'm just going to pose that first of all. So Stacey asked, I'd be interested to know how you navigate your work with students if they're reluctant to use or do not have access to personal devices. Perhaps this isn't an issue for you, or hasn't come about for you. But I suppose it's interesting just to consider it anyway as a question. If you came across a student who was reluctant or didn't have access to devices, how would you go about resolving that?
The truth is I haven't faced such an issue so far. And when we use mobile phone cameras, in most cases we won't have an issue because it doesn't have to be a smartphone, for example. It can be any phone, even an older version with a camera. But it has happened to me that, for example, one of the students had issues, and then I would give my phone for the specific experiment. But I think the other way around would be, I guess, hiring from the university equipment for the work to make sure that all students can access it, like tablets. But the truth is that sometimes I don't even use technology. So, for example, about the Facebook exercise, what I've actually done is that I've printed the questions that Facebook asks and gave around those questions to the students to respond, instead of creating a fake Facebook account, because now it's really difficult actually to do that. It used to be an easy thing to do. So I would give a written form that actually is inspired by the Facebook questions, and then they will respond to that. And we do, for example, do exercises offline. They don't have to have the use of technology. In terms of, I don't think students are reluctant. I think they really enjoy using those technologies because it's what they use in everyday life. And what we tend to do is that we give them space to bring platforms and apps that we don't really use, like TikTok and Snapchat is not the platforms I would go for. But because students know how to use them, we are open in those terms, and we want to see what they can bring in as well, and what knowledge they can bring in. And the important thing is to play around those, to see how we can hack them and use them in a different way, like Maria talked about the computers. So how we can use those platforms in a different way to engage with audiences or to create a performance. So for example, another thing that they've done was that like not all of the students use Twitter. So I've created one Twitter account and shared the login details with the whole group of the students. And then I gave them each student a day to, we had like a free writing exercise. And then each student would share tweets for a specific day based on those free writing work. So it would be anonymous since it's one account that is shared across different people, but it also engaged them into using platforms that they might have not used, or a platform that they're really familiar with, to use it in a different way and learn how to use it. I think it's really important what we discussed as part of Maria's exercise, that it's not anymore about so much about going and getting training. You won't get a training on how to use Twitter or how to use Facebook or YouTube. It's more about experimenting and playing around and finding the different features. Of course, you might have a question like we had for Blackboard Collaborate and ask an expert for an answer, or look around on YouTube to find answers. But there's this idea also for when we ask them to create blogs. We suggest them to look at WordPress or Tumblr, and we don't do a training on how to use those, because it's very straightforward, that when you open it, it kind of guides you around in terms of how to use it. Of course, we're open there to answer any questions they might have, but it's this idea with the online tools that especially those that are for social and public use, you don't really need training. It's more about playing around and finding how to use the different features.
Okay, fantastic. There's a couple of questions haven't come in for both, so it'd be great to get both your answers on this. So Nazli asks, in considering endocolonization, can you talk about the performance training genres emerging that are overlapping and diverging with reductive surveillance or censorship? Maria, do you cover?
Well, I just wanted to ask what Natalie means by endocolonization. If you're there, Nazli, and you've got access to a microphone.
Yeah, I've enabled. Oh, here we go.
Oh, I see. Okay. No, I'm not aware of relationship between. Right. Okay, got you. I'm not aware of the relationship between performer training pedagogies or exercises or approaches, and how they relate to systems of surveillance, whether we're talking about post-colonial contexts or the global north. I think it's a very, very interesting question, though, and this is again another way in which technology manifests, and it's a way that quite conveniently we're asked to forget about it, but it's constantly there and it constantly operates, and it looks like it's going to become intensified. And I suppose, again, you may find a lot of links to performer training. So, for example, one of the key ideas of 20th century, 21st century psychophysical practices has been this idea of awareness towards the environment. And again, that kind of awareness is, the whole, if you want, rhetoric and the practices around awareness developed before the kind of surveillance we're experiencing today. And it kind of meant becoming aware of one's environment and fellow human beings. And now this environment is decidedly a lot more complex, and politically and ethically more complex as well. So for me, a very interesting area for future study would be to explore where does this understanding and practice of psychophysical awareness sit in relation to regimes of surveillance. So this is why perhaps I'm not sure if I made this clear enough, but the kind of project I wanted to put forward is more about a space to think and possibilities about thinking rather than an exhaustive map of everything that can be thought. I think there is a lot to be thought. And if you want, what I'm trying to do is kickstart that process where people begin to see between the two fields that go beyond simplistic or simplified questions around use or not use. Because as I said, I think the relationship is so much more complex and interesting. Yeah, I'm just gonna leave it there. Thank you, but that was a great question.
Yeah, I think it kind of supports the idea that that you pose, that there is a need for a theoretical framework for those relationships. So yeah, great stuff. There are some more questions coming in. So Belinda, this again is for both. So if we could start with Christina on this one. Do you think the use of technology as performance, i.e. live streaming, provides any sort of unique experience for those performing and watching that cannot be replicated in a traditional live face-to-face performance? So we often have the other question the other way around, but it's
yeah. I think it's very interesting because it cannot replace it. It's nothing that cannot be replicated in a traditional live face-to-face performance when it's live streaming. But what I think it offers a tool for people who cannot be in the same space, whether that's because of they're geographically distributed and they don't have the money to come in together, like we've seen in the past with companies doing online work because they were really spread around the world and they were invited in a festival and they couldn't go, so they did an online work via Skype, and that's you're invited in by embodying fictions. But especially now with COVID-19, I think it is a tool that can be used to bring remote people together that cannot be in the same space for social or physical distancing purposes. But of course, I don't think this will change how theatre is traditionally done when we go back. Personally, for my practice work, I haven't used streaming. I'm not in favor of streaming. Instead, I've been using a purpose-built platform, which is Upstage, which is an open source platform for online theatre and performance. And this platform allows you to have streaming. It's not anymore, but you can have avatars. The most important bit for me in this type of performance that cannot happen in a face-to-face performance is the chat box. Like here, you can ask questions by typing on the chat box. And if we were not streaming, and it was a very different kind of communication where we would try it to you, it would be a more equal kind of communication and collaboration between audiences and performers. And this is where actually audiences can reflect on what is happening, can ask questions to the performers, they can debate with one another. They had cases in the performances I've been doing where people will have different opinions and will start a dialogue in between them. They would even change the topic of the performance. For example, it was about the revolution in Egypt in 2011, and audiences would take the discussion in the situation in Greece at that point with the economic crisis, and the actual performance would change because of that. And I feel this is very rare and very difficult to happen in a face-to-face performance. It has happened, but it's really difficult for an audience to step up and go on stage and talk about something, or especially because it's visual and you know who is talking. While in this kind of performances, it's usually anonymous. So the real you can chat, or the real troll within you can really try to troll and push and challenge things. And I think this is what I find fascinating about the online. Of course, the rest, I think, of course, I'm a theatre person, so I've just experimented online, but I found that specific bit really talked to me, and especially in terms of how I see theatre in Brechtian terms.
I suppose there's that a question of time as well, isn't there? Where you know, after a live performance, you tend to get people talking and writing afterwards, but the kind of instantaneous experience that we have here with the chat and so on is there's that potential for better for worse, but it's an interesting potential. Cool.
You can write where you are based in the beginning, and something you cannot really do in a performance, go around everyone and ask where they come from. They are, of course, cases, but it's not how we used to do it. And I think it's this communication between performers and audiences that, of course, it's a different kind of communication in the theatre, in the theatre space, than the one online. But I really like this dialectical form of communication.
Yes. Maria, do you have any thoughts you want to share on that?
Sorry, I keep forgetting to unmute my mic. I talk for a bit and then I realize that nothing is happening. Well, I just wanted to say that it's that any, you know, if we go back to this kind of distinction that Ide is drawing between mediated and unmediated experience, which of course is very, very blurred in actual real life. But still, if we say, okay, it kind of allows us to draw a distinction. I think it goes without saying that any kind of technology will affect the user's experience and the user's relationship to the world. And equally, the absence of technology will affect the user's experience and the user's relationship to the world. For me, I suppose the question is how and what exactly that experience is, who is, if you want, who is involved in creating this experience. My concern with a lot of the technologies that have become very popular in the last few years is that we are not their makers. And in fact, they are part of production histories whose chain is so long that cannot be traced. For example, mobile phones, that we cannot, for example, know for sure if child labor was involved in the making of our mobile phones. There is no way to train the production chain. And so I'm thinking that, you know, if we are involved in a reflexive embodied practice, we need to be mindful of the baggage that a technology will bring with it, and the various agencies, the various prescriptions that may be explicit or implicit about the ways we should be using it, and specifically about the ways it manages or flavors our relationship to the world. Because I think it really does affect the way we become and understand ourselves as subjects and as citizens. So this is for me, and I think it's absolutely, it's very, very exciting that we can actually test those technologies through performance. And in fact, performance might be the perfect space to start to open up those dialogues.
Yeah, fantastic. So we just go on to another question. Again, this is towards the. This is from David, talking about the FaceBrook and the empty space. So what divides the genre of performing online from video and film? Is it so? It is slightly a different question, or puts another level on Belinda's question. Is it different than theatre, or does it become its own genre, like YouTubers or vlogs? What do you think?
So, just to say, the continuous thing, because it's similar with the streaming, I think. That I think what is dangerous with online performance is that performers enjoy more doing online work than audiences, and that can be very dangerous, because especially in live streaming, sometimes audiences might feel isolated and might feel excluded from the fun, that they cannot really interact what is going on, because we are used to use technology in such an interactive way. There is like YouTube chat boxes that are happening on YouTube when it's live streaming, but usually, you know, this kind of performance happen on platforms like Zoom, but audiences are on YouTube, and they are separated in different platforms. And for me, for example, I don't know if you've seen the Show Must Go Online, which is a group of performers that are doing every week as part of as a response to COVID-19 and the lockdown. They are doing weekly readings of Shakespeare plays, and they do it through Zoom. Of course, they're on across the world, and they stream it live on YouTube. And I find it really difficult to stay focused usually. But because on YouTube there is the chat box where audiences share messages and they talk to each other, they create a sense of co-presence, of liveness. And this is very similar to the theatrical co-presence. And then during the interval, performers will look at the questions that are asked on the YouTube, and they will respond to those questions, and they will read some of those messages. So you really get the sense of this is happening here and now. And for me, this is what defines theater, the here and now, while film is more about a recorded medium that is already pre-recorded and cannot be changed, and you cannot really interact with it. So more what National Theatre London did during the lockdown, where they would stream pre-recorded performances. And that for me is more like not online theatre, but more like theatre online or theatre film that is related to theatre, but it falls more into the film. I'm really interested in and looking at those intermediate genres of theatre film for me, because we have now more films being interested towards liveness and playing with liveness and with live audiences in different ways. But also we have now theatres who are doing very similar to video kind of work, with even live streaming, that it looks like a film, and it's that you know that it's live that makes it a theater. But I'm really interested in those questions. So yeah, thanks, David.
Okay. We've only a few minutes left, but there's a really interesting extension to Belinda's question has come through from Manali. And it's about, is it worth making a distinction between audience experience and performer experience? I.e. the distinction on creating an experience that is accessible and perceptible by viewers, or on an esoteric experience based on performers' understanding and expression of the work's concept or narrative? Or do you think that's a distinction not worth making? If we could start with Maria on this, what would your thoughts be?
Yeah, I think we absolutely need to make this distinction. I think it's the proof is in the pudding, isn't it? And I think that's the problem that most actors or performers face at some point, that they know what they want to communicate, but maybe they don't have the skills or they don't have the technical ability to be managed to do what they want to do. But my if you want, my thinking is not even considering the point of the performance, is even before we perform, is what happens in that space of preparation before we let the audiences in, when it's the 5 of us or 15 of us, or perhaps, you know, if we look at MOOCs, the 1,000 of us in one space. What happens in that space of preparation, and how that space, precisely because it is less fixed in relation to performance, it is more processual, whether it can allow us to reconsider ways of being, ways of relating, ways of doing things again and again and again and again, instead of following a particular recipe.
Christina, do you have any thoughts on that?
Just to add on what I also mentioned earlier about the different the performers having enjoying more the online work than audiences. I think when I was doing the ETH project, and collaborators are collaborated with people that haven't used or haven't done online theater before, and from dance, but also from more technology backgrounds. And when we were rehearsing, it was really, they couldn't get it. We did rehearse, we did prepare the performance, but they couldn't get it. And when we moved into the actual day of the performance with a live audience, then they actually got. And they were really excited about it. When the audiences started typing them questions and starting discussions with them, they got really excited about that. So in that case, it worked opposite, I think. It was when the audiences arrived that they got excited. But I feel that in order to keep audiences in, I think it's really difficult in keeping concentration in such a work. It needs to have some sort of to allow audiences to interrupt and engage, and keeping them in that space, because it's easily, we can just go on our phones, and when someone is talking, look at something different, look at their Facebook. So keeping people in the platform in different ways, I think it's kind of important to create a good experience for audiences. Otherwise, it might end up being a very fun thing for the performers that audiences cannot really engage with.
Okay, so we are just coming up to 4 o'clock now, but I suppose my thought on that would be that there are existing questions in both virtual spaces and theatre performance space or live performance spaces that still exist within this combined space, which I think is really interesting. Just a last thought from Manali has come in, just to see what you think of this as well. So you suggest that technology allows performance makers to bridge the gap between audience and performance experience?
I think some bridge the gap between performers, yes, and what audiences think. I feel like, you know, in a theater space, usually audiences' responses to what they see is hidden somewhere in the darkness of the third row. You might hear what they discuss in the cafe area later on, but that's very rare to happen. You cannot know what is going on. By allowing them to be interactive and type in real time, you do get responses. You do get their opinions on things and how they feel about things. So I'm not sure about the experience itself, because sometimes we might say it's the opposite. But I think it's more about this allowing them to have a dialectic response.
The kind of passive active kind of negotiation, maybe. Okay. Yeah. Maria, do you have any final thoughts on that?
Oh, no. I think Christina has more expertise than me on this.
Okay, well, I think that's a good moment to say thank you very much to certainly both our speakers and to everybody who's joined in and been so active in joining in with both activity and questions. It does kind of show that we can keep sharing happening despite lockdown and so on. With that, again, thank you to everyone, and come again for the next thing. Christina, do you want to say if there's anything coming up?
I just want to say thank you to you, Denis, for chairing this event, and special thanks to Maria for joining us today to this research seminar. We've been trying to do it for some time now, but many things have happened. From the first time we talked, it was the university, the first time, the strikes. Then it was COVID-19. So we thought, okay, let's experiment and do it online. And thank you all for coming, all audiences and participants, and joining us today. And we hope you've enjoyed it. It's kind of difficult to be here.
Yes, absolutely. Well, thank you so much. Just to say as well that we're planning on reviewing this and putting it on various platforms. So keep an eye out on Twitter and Facebook and things. I think Christina has a list of attendees that we can get in touch with where to find further thoughts. One being the theatre, dance and performance training blog. So keep an eye on all those kind of platforms. All right. Okay,
Great.
guys. Thank you.
Thank you all.
All the best.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.